There is a particular kind of morning that comes only once in a man's life. Not the morning after a hard year, or a bad harvest, or the death of someone he loved. Those mornings are hard, but they have a shape a man can recognize. They have edges. This other kind of morning has no edges. It begins in the dark, and it smells like smoke, and it ends with a man standing in his own driveway looking at the place where his life used to be. Leland Pruitt had that morning on July 14th, 1971. But before we get to that morning, before we get to the smoke and the ash and the insurance man and the 7-year-old girl standing barefoot in the ruins of everything her family had built, you need to understand the man. You need to understand what he had made and what it cost him to make it, and why, when the morning came that was supposed to end it, he refused to let it end. In the summer of 2001, 30 years after the fire, a woman named Delia Pruitt drove down a county road in Fillmore County, Nebraska, and turned onto a gravel drive she had known since before she could read. She was 37 years old. She had spent a decade in Lincoln working for an agricultural cooperative, doing work she was good at, living a life that made sense on paper and that had been pulling at her quietly and persistently like a current beneath a still water, drawing her back to this particular piece of ground since the day she left it. She parked in front of the barn, not the original barn. That barn had burned before she was old enough to remember it clearly. This barn was a different thing, salvaged and assembled an improbable structure that her father had built from the frame of a tornado-damaged pole building in Saline County, and tin from a demolished grain elevator, and sliding doors from a closed dairy operation 2 counties over. The tin did not match. The doors were different colors. The whole structure had the quality of something that should not have held together as long as it had, and yet it had held together for nearly 30 years, through Nebraska winters and Nebraska winds and the accumulated weight of everything a working barn accumulates. Delia walked through the door. The barn smelled the way it had always smelled: oil and grease and the dry dust of old hay and the particular metallic scent of machinery that has been used and maintained over a long period of time. Harness hooks on the walls. A workbench along the east side with tools arranged with a precision that was her father's habit and no one else's. And in the corner, in the spot where it had stood for 9 years since her father retired it from fieldwork, the Farmall 60. It was not a beautiful machine. It had never been beautiful. But what it was, and what it had always been, was present. It was there in a way that few things are there, with the solidity of something that has survived what it was not supposed to survive and carries that survival in its surfaces. The paint was scorched in places where no repainting had ever fully covered what the fire had done. The hood carried the particular discoloration of metal that has been close to intense heat, a mottled darkness that the years had not erased. Delia put her hand on the hood. On the wall behind the tractor, her father had mounted a piece of scrap wood. He had burned the words into it with a soldering iron, each letter careful and deliberate, the way Leland Pruitt did everything. This tractor survived the fire of July 14th, 1971. So did we. Delia read it the way she had read it 100 times before. Then she stood in the quiet of the barn and let the morning be what it was. The first morning of her responsibility. The first morning of the next chapter of whatever this land would become. She was thinking about her father. She was thinking about a question she had asked him when she was 7 years old, standing barefoot in the ashes of the only home she had ever known, while the house was still burning behind her. Let us go back to that night. Let us go back to Fillmore County, Nebraska, in the summer of 1971. Let us go back to a farm of 200 acres that Leland Pruitt had been working for 11 years since his own father had retired, and handed him the land and the equipment and a handshake that contained more obligation and more love than most contracts ever managed to express. Leland was 38 years old in the summer of 1971. He had been farming this ground since 1960, and he had farmed it the way his father had taught him to farm it, which was to say carefully, without debt, with the understanding that the land was not a vehicle for getting rich, but a responsibility that would outlast any individual man and needed to be treated accordingly. His father had told him something once, that Leland had carried the way you carry a thing when you do not know how important it is until much later. Never owe more than you can pay if the worst year of your life happens tomorrow. 11 years of farming with that principle had produced a modest operation. Not large, not impressive by the standards of men who measured themselves against their neighbors, 200 acres of Nebraska ground a barn and workshop and grain bins, a house where Leland and his wife Vera had raised their daughter Delia, a John Deere 3.2 stored in the tractor bay, and a Farmall 5.6 that served as the working backbone of the operation. Everything paid for, nothing borrowed. Vera was the one who kept the books. She had a precise and patient mind for numbers, and she sat at the kitchen table most evenings with a ledger and a sharpened pencil and kept track of where the farm stood with the same quiet diligence that Leland brought to the fields. They did not always agree on everything, but they agreed on the fundamental thing, which was that the farm was theirs and they intended to keep it that way. Delia was 7 years old that summer. She was a child who paid attention to things, not in the anxious way of children who are worried about the adult world, but in the observant way of children who are genuinely interested in how things work. She watched her father grease the front axle of the Farmall 5.6 one evening in early July, asking questions about what each fitting did and why the grease had to go there specifically and what would happen if it did not. Leland answered her questions the way he answered most things directly and without condescension, because he believed that a child who asks a serious question deserves a serious answer. He did not finish the job that evening. He had gotten through most of it, but not all of it, and by the time he had answered Delia's questions and put the tools away and washed his hands and come in for supper, the light was gone and the day was done. He would finish in the morning. He left the Farmall outside, parked 50 yards east of the barn next to the fuel tank, planning to pull it in after he finished the axle work the next day. This is the detail that everything else depends on. A grease job he did not finish. A tractor left outside one night because the evening ran out before the work did. In the long chain of causes that leads to any outcome, this one belongs near the beginning. The night of July 13th was clear. Hot the way Nebraska July nights are hot, with no wind and the stars very bright, and the kind of stillness that can feel like peace or can feel like the world holding its breath. Leland and Vera went to bed at their usual hour. Delia was asleep in the back bedroom with her stuffed rabbit, the one she had named without irony for reasons that only a 7-year-old could fully explain. At 2:14 in the morning, the clock in the kitchen stopped. Leland knew the exact time because the lightning that hit the barn traveled along the power line to the house and stopped the clock when it caught the attic insulation on fire. He did not know this yet when he opened his eyes. What he knew was the sound, a crack so loud and so close that it did not sound like thunder. It sounded like the world breaking open at a seam. He was on his feet before he was fully awake. He pulled back the curtain and saw the orange glow where the barn should have been. There are moments in a man's life that divide everything into before and after. Leland Pruitt had that moment at 2:14 in the morning on July 14th, 1971, standing at the bedroom window in Fillmore County, Nebraska, watching his barn burn. He got Vera first. Then they got Delia, still half asleep, clutching her rabbit, carried out the front door into the driveway. The heat when they came outside was physical, a pressure against the skin, not just warmth, but force. The barn was fully involved. Dry hay and dry wood and diesel fuel in the tractor bay, and 30 years of accumulated grease on the shop floor. The building burned with the purposeful intensity of something that has been waiting for permission. The grain bins were burning, 12,000 bushels of stored wheat from last year's harvest list. Wheat that Leland had been holding for a better price was burning. The John Deere 320 in the tractor bay was burning. The workshop attached to the barn was burning. 2 neighbors arrived within 20 minutes, having seen the glow from 3 miles away, but there was nothing to do. You do not fight a fire like that. You stand back and you watch and you try to understand what you are seeing. Then the house caught. The fire had traveled along the power line and ignited the attic insulation, and by the time anyone noticed it, the attic was going. Within an hour, the house was burning as thoroughly as the barn had burned, and Leland and Vera and Delia stood in the driveway in their pajamas and watched 30 years of family history become smoke. Leland stood very still while it burned. This is what people who were there that night would remember about him. Not that he wept, though he may have. Not that he shouted or moved toward the burning buildings or had to be restrained. He stood still. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he watched his farm burn with the particular stillness of a man who is thinking rather than reacting, who is somewhere inside himself working through something that has not finished revealing its shape yet. Vera sat on the tailgate of a neighbor's pickup with a blanket around her shoulders, and she wept quietly, the contained weeping of a woman who is allowing herself to feel the full weight of what has happened while the man beside her is not yet ready to feel it, who is still somewhere else, still in the process of understanding. Delia was asleep on the front seat of the same pickup, curled around her rabbit the way children sleep when they have been carried from their beds in the dark and placed somewhere safe and told without words that the adults will handle what needs handling. By dawn, the fire had burned itself out. What remained was ash, concrete foundations, twisted metal roofing, the chimney of the house standing alone against the morning sky like a broken finger pointing at nothing, the shell of a grain bin that looked like a crushed tin can, the smell of wet ash and burned diesel, and the particular acrid smell of things that were not meant to burn, but burned anyway. And one other thing, 50 yards east of where the barn had been next to the fuel tank, the Farmall 560 was standing. The paint was scorched. The seat cushion had melted from the radiant heat, leaving bare metal frame. The rubber on the steering wheel had warped and softened. The wiring harness was damaged, but the engine was intact. The hydraulics were intact. The transmission was intact. The machine had been close enough to the fire to be damaged by its heat, but far enough away to survive it. Because Leland had left it outside the night before. Because he had not finished the grease job. Because a 7-year-old girl had asked good questions about how machinery worked, and the evening had run out before the work was done. Leland walked over to it at dawn. He climbed up onto the bare metal seat frame, the scorched metal cold against his legs in the July morning. He looked at the ruins of his farm from the tractor seat. Then he reached forward and turned the key. The engine turned over once. Nothing. Twice. It caught. It ran rough for a moment, burning off something from the heat exposure, and then it settled into its idle. The sound of a working engine on a farm that no longer had a barn or a house or a workshop or a grain bin or any other piece of working equipment. Leland sat on that tractor for a long time. He did not drive it anywhere. He just sat and let it idle and looked at what the night had made of 11 years of careful building. Vera was behind him watching. Delia was still asleep in the truck. He was thinking about his father, about the handshake in 1960 and what it had contained, about 11 years of farming without debt, about the principle that you never owe more than you can pay if the worst year of your life happens tomorrow. His worst year had arrived not in increments, but all at once in a single night, and it had taken almost everything. Almost. The engine was running. 3 days later, Roy Stassen drove down the county road in a company sedan from the Great Plains Mutual office in Lincoln. He was 53 years old, and he had done this job for 25 years, and he had the specific professional manner of a man who has seen enough of other people's disasters to have developed a framework for processing them efficiently. He wore a suit that belonged in an office in Lincoln, and he carried a clipboard and a folder of forms and a Polaroid camera, and he walked the property with Leland in the July heat and documented everything with the systematic thoroughness of a man who has done this before and knows what the documentation will eventually produce. They sat at a folding table that a neighbor had set up in the yard in the shade of the elm tree that had survived the fire by virtue of being on the wrong side of the house. Roy opened his folder. The structures policy covered $15,200. The equipment policy covered an additional $8,300 for the combine and the John Deere. The stored grain was covered under a separate provision for $4,200. Total payout $27,700. Leland nodded. He had expected something in that range. The policy was old, written in 1962 when the house was worth less and the barn was smaller. He had never updated it. He knew this was his mistake, and he did not try to make it into something else. Roy continued. The assessed value of the land was $42,000. At current market prices, the 200 acres could sell for approximately $50,000. Between the insurance payout and the land sale, Leland could walk away with approximately $77,000. Roy pushed a form across the table. Total loss settlement. He explained what it meant. He said the words, fresh start. He said the words somewhere else. He said the words enough to begin again. Vera was sitting beside Leland. She did not look at the form. She looked at the land behind Roy Stassen's shoulder, the fields that had not burned the wheat that was still in the ground, the soil that was the same soil it had been before the fire, because fire does not change soil. It burns what sits on top of it, and it leaves the ground beneath untouched. What happens to the soil if we sell, she said. Roy looked at her. The question did not fit into the framework he had brought with him from Lincoln. He did not have an answer for it because it was not the kind of question people asked in his experience. When a farm burned to the ground, the farmer sold the land and signed the settlement and moved somewhere else. That was the equation. Fire plus insurance plus land sale equals new life somewhere else. It was clean and it was logical, and in his 25 years of doing this work, it was almost always what happened. Leland looked at the form. He looked at the number. He looked at the ruins of the farm still smelling of smoke and wet ash in the July heat. He did not touch the form. Roy waited. Leland said he needed to think about it. Roy left the form on the table and said he would give him some time. He said the claim would stay open. He drove back to Lincoln with his clipboard and his Polaroid photographs in his folder, and he told the office that he expected the Pruitt claim to resolve within 60 days. He had seen this before. A man needed time to accept what had happened. That was reasonable. The settlement would get signed. That evening in the neighbor's spare room where the family was staying, Delia woke up. She climbed out of the bed where someone had placed her, and she walked through the house in her bare feet, and she found her father sitting alone on the front steps in the dark. She sat down beside him. She held her rabbit in her lap. She looked at the dark sky and the distant orange glow on the horizon where the ruins of the farm were still holding some of the day's heat. Then she looked up at her father. "Daddy," she said, "are we going to lose the farm?" She was 7 years old. She did not know what an insurance settlement was. She did not know what total loss meant in the language of policies and adjusters. She knew that this was her home, the fields where she chased things, the barn where the cats lived, the driveway where her father had held her on his lap and let her steer the Farmall at 5 miles an hour while he worked the pedals. She knew one thing with the absolute certainty of a child who has not yet learned to doubt the things she knows. This was her home, and someone needed to tell her whether it was going to remain her home. "Daddy, are we going to lose the farm?" Leland looked down at his daughter in the dark. He could smell the smoke that was still in his clothes, still in his hair, still in the air around them. The heat from what had burned was on his back. His daughter's face was turned up toward his with the specific trust of a child who believes that her father knows the answer to the question she is asking. He did not know the answer. He had $23 in his wallet and $400 in total to his name, and a burned tractor, and 200 acres of land, and a ruined farm and a piece of paper on a folding table with a number on it that was supposed to be the solution. He looked at his daughter. "No," he said. "We are going to build it back." He did not say how. He did not say when. He said it the way a man says a thing when he has decided it not as a plan, but as a fact, as a statement about what the future would contain, regardless of the obstacles between here and there. Delia nodded. She leaned against his arm. After a while, she went back inside and went to sleep. Leland sat on the steps alone for a long time. He was thinking about the Farmall 560. He was thinking about the grease job he had not finished and the tractor left outside because of it, and the engine that had started on the second try at dawn, while the ruins of his farm were still warm around it. He was thinking about the wheat in the ground, the crop planted in October of the previous year that was still growing in the fields that the fire had not touched, that nobody had mentioned when they talked about what had been lost because the fire had not taken the crop. The fire had taken everything that sat above the ground and had not been able to reach what was in the ground, and what was in the ground was a harvest that was still coming. He was thinking about the $77,000 on the piece of paper on the folding table. He was thinking about what his father had said. Never owe more than you can pay if the worst year of your life happens tomorrow. This was the worst year. It had arrived faster and more completely than any version of it he had imagined when he heard those words. But the principles still held. He had not borrowed. He was not in debt. The insurance money and the land value were not obligations he had to meet. They were choices. He could sign the form and take the money and sell the land and go somewhere else and start a different kind of life, and no one could call him a failure for it. The fire had been lightning. It had been an act of the sky. No reasonable person would blame a man for taking his settlement and moving on. But the land was still there. The soil that his father had handed him in 1960 was still there, unchanged by fire, waiting for the next seed. The way soil waits for seed with the absolute patience of something that has been doing one thing for 10,000 years and is in no hurry. 200 acres of Nebraska ground that had never owed anything to anyone because Leland had never borrowed against it. And the Farmall 560 was still running. He thought about these two things for a long time in the dark on the front steps of his neighbor's house. He thought about them with the specific kind of thinking that happens when a man strips away everything that is not essential and looks at what remains. What remained was ground and one machine and a promise he had just made to his daughter. The next morning, he did not call Roy Stassen. He went to town instead. He went to the hardware store and he bought a new wiring harness for the Farmall 560, and he stopped at the neighbor's equipment yard and found a used seat that would fit, and he bought a can of black spray paint for the worst of the scorched metal. He spent $62. He had $338 left. He drove back to the farm and he parked in the driveway and he looked at what was there. Foundations, ash, the chimney, the crushed grain bin, the Farmall 560 with its scorched paint and its melted seat and its warped steering wheel and its running engine. He got his tools out of the truck. He was going to fix the tractor. Then he was going to harvest the wheat. Then he was going to figure out what came next. He was not going to think about all of it at once because all of it at once was too large to think about. He was going to think about the next thing and then the thing after that the way his father had taught him to approach any problem that was too large to solve in a single motion. The next thing was the tractor. He started working. Vera came out an hour later and stood beside the Farmall and watched him work for a moment without speaking. Then she went back inside to the neighbor's house, to the folding table where she had set up the ledger and her sharpened pencils, and she began to work through the numbers of what came next. How much the wheat crop would bring if the harvest was average. How much a used mobile home would cost. What the minimum viable path from here to something resembling a working farm would require in terms of dollars and time, and the kind of patience that is not passive but active, that does not wait for things to get better but builds toward them. They did not discuss whether to stay. That had been decided the night before on a neighbor's front steps in the dark by a man who had made a promise to a 7-year-old girl. They discussed what staying would require. Outside in the July heat, Leland Pruitt put a new wiring harness in a burned tractor and painted over the worst of the scorched metal with a can of black paint and installed a mismatched seat that would never look right. And when he was done, he climbed up and started the engine and listened to it run. The insurance man was in Lincoln waiting for a phone call that was not going to come. The wheat was in the ground. The land was still there. And Leland Pruitt, 38 years old, standing in the driveway of a farm that had burned to its foundations, had $400 and a running tractor and the absolute certainty that he was not finished. He had told his daughter they were going to build it back. He was going to start right now. The first thing Leland Pruitt did with his $62 tractor repair was drive it to the field. Not to prove anything, not to show anyone. He drove it to the field because the field was where the work was, and the work was what came next. And Leland Pruitt had organized his entire adult life around the principle that the next thing in front of you is the thing you do, and the thing in front of him was 200 acres of wheat that was still growing in the ground, and that needed to be harvested before it did not. It was the last week of July 1971. The wheat had come in well. Not a record year, but a solid year, the kind of year that rewards the man who planted correctly and tended carefully and asked nothing of the crop except that it do what wheat does when treated with respect. 31 bushels to the acre on 200 acres. The math was simple and the math was good, or it would have been good if Leland still had a combine to harvest it with. He did not have a combine. His combine had burned with everything else. He drove the Farmall 560 down the county road to his neighbor Harlan Goss's property on a Tuesday morning and found Harlan in the equipment yard checking the header on his combine before the season started. Harlan was 60 years old and had farmed the 320 acres to the east of the Pruitt ground for 35 years and was the kind of neighbor that farm country produces when it is working the way farm country is supposed to work. He was not sentimental and he was not given to long speeches about community and mutual obligation. But he was the man who had shown up on the night of the fire, and the man who had set up the folding table in the yard for the insurance meeting, and the man who had offered the spare room without being asked. Leland told him what he was thinking. He would not have the cash to pay for combining until after he sold the grain. He was proposing a trade. Harlan would harvest the Pruitt wheat with his combine. In exchange, Leland would do custom tillage work for Harlan through the fall, plowing, dissing, chisel work, all of it with the Farmall. Work for work. No cash changing hands until the harvest proceeds came in. Harlan listened to this without expression. He looked at the scorched Farmall 560 sitting in his equipment yard, the mismatched seat and the warped steering wheel, and the paint that was black in some places and scorched to bare metal in others. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that has survived something it should not have survived, with a specific evaluative respect. He said he would do it. They shook hands, and that was the agreement, and neither of them felt the need to put anything further on it. The harvest took 4 days. Harlan ran the combine, and Leland hauled grain in a borrowed truck to the elevator in Geneva, making run after run through the August heat while Delia rode along and asked questions about the elevator and how it worked and why the grain had to be tested for moisture content before they would buy it. Leland answered every question. He was not a man who believed that the details of the work should be kept from children who wanted to understand them. The wheat checked in at just over 31 bushels to the acre, 6,200 bushels total. At $1.52 a bushel at the elevator that day, the gross was $9,424. After accounting for the seed cost and the fertilizer he had applied before the fire and the fuel for Harlan's combining operation, Leland netted approximately $7,200. Roy Stassen had walked past that wheat without mentioning it. He had looked at the foundations and the grain bins and the burned equipment, and he had calculated a total loss, and he had not once looked out at the fields where 31 bushels to the acre was waiting to be cut. Perhaps it had not occurred to him. Perhaps the fields were not part of the policy and therefore not part of what he was there to document. Whatever the reason, the man who had offered Leland $77,000 to walk away had not noticed the $7,200 that was already in the ground waiting to be taken. Leland put the money in the bank alongside the untouched insurance payout. He did not touch the insurance money. He had decided from the beginning, though he had not said it aloud to anyone, that the insurance money was for structures, buildings, the things that had burned. He would rebuild the farm from the farm itself, from what the land could produce, and he would hold the insurance money until the time came to use it for what it was meant for. The first thing the farm needed to produce was somewhere to live. Vera had found it. She had been making calls from the neighbor's kitchen for 2 weeks, working through leads, the way she worked through ledger columns, methodically, not stopping until she had found what she was looking for. A family in York was upgrading from a 1963 mobile home, 12 feet wide and 60 feet long, 3 bedrooms. They wanted $2,200 for it, and they wanted it gone. Leland drove to York to look at it. It was not a beautiful thing. It had the quality of most used mobile homes from that era, a kind of stubborn functionality. Everything basic and nothing extra, and all of it showing its age in ways that could not be fixed with paint. But the roof was sound, and the floors were solid, and the furnace worked, and it had 3 bedrooms, and it would arrive in 2 weeks and sit on the concrete foundation where the house had stood. He paid $2,200 from the insurance fund, the first dollars he had spent from it. The mobile home was delivered on a Thursday and set on the foundation and connected to the well and the propane tank, and on a Friday evening, Leland and Vera and Delia ate dinner at a folding table in their own home for the first time since July 14th. The plates were borrowed, the table was borrowed, the chairs were from a neighbor's garage, but the address was theirs and the walls around them were theirs, and when Delia went to sleep that night in the smallest of the 3 bedrooms, she did not need to be carried to the bed. She walked there herself on her own floor. Merle Kimball noticed the mobile home in August. Merle ran the John Deere dealership in Geneva. He was the kind of man who understood the equipment business thoroughly and the farming business somewhat less thoroughly, and who filled the gap in his understanding with the confidence of a man who sells the tools of an industry and has therefore concluded that he understands the industry. He had driven past the Pruitt property twice a week for years, and he had seen the fire, and he had seen the aftermath, and he had formed an opinion, as men like Merle Kimball form opinions quickly and with certainty. He said it at the co-op in late August to a group of men who were there buying seed. Warren Pruitt is farming with a scorched Farmall in a mobile home. That is not farming. That is camping. Give him a year and he will be looking for work at the feed mill in Geneva. The men who heard this said nothing in particular. Some of them had known Leland Pruitt for 20 years. Some of them had been on the county road the night of the fire. They did not contradict Merle because Merle was not a man who received contradiction gracefully, and because the situation did look from the outside like something that might resolve the way Merle was predicting. Leland heard about it the following week. A man at the elevator mentioned it not unkindly the way people in small communities sometimes deliver information they are not sure how to classify. Leland listened to it. He nodded. He thanked the man for telling him. He drove home and he went to work. He did not respond to it. He did not think about it very much. He had an understanding about what other people's opinions of his situation were worth, and that understanding could be expressed very simply. They were worth exactly as much as the work he did not do because of them, which was to say they were worth nothing at all. The fall of 1971 was the hardest season he had ever worked. Harlan Goss had 320 acres that needed tillage work done before winter. Leland had agreed to do it in exchange for the combining, and he did it putting the Farmall on the field every morning at first light and running it until the light was gone, plowing and dissing and chiseling through October and into November, while the temperature dropped and the ground hardened toward its winter state. He put over 1,400 hours on the Farmall that first year after the fire. Oil change every 75 hours, grease, every fitting every morning before he started the kind of maintenance discipline that is not optional when the machine is the only thing standing between you and ruin. The Farmall did not stop. It ran through all of it, but the scorched paint and the mismatched seat and the warped steering wheel became as familiar to Leland as his own hands over that fall, and he found in the relationship between a man and a machine that he depends on completely a kind of clarity. There was no room in that clarity for anything that was not the work. The neighbors who doubted, and the insurance man waiting in Lincoln, and the piece of paper with the number on it that was still sitting somewhere in a folder in an office, and the question of what this would eventually become. None of that was the work. The work was the field in front of him, and the machine under him, and the task of turning the ground before winter. By the end of 1971, 5 months after the fire, Leland had $11,000 in the bank. He had spent less than $3,000 of the insurance money. He had earned $7,200 from the wheat crop and nearly $4,000 in cash from custom tillage work for 4 different neighbors who needed field preparation done and who had heard that the Pruitt operation had a man and a machine available. He had not borrowed a dollar. The following spring, Leland planted his 200 acres and tended the crop and harvested it in the fall, and the numbers were similar to the year before and the money went into the bank. He did custom work through the autumn. He bought tool lots at farm auctions, not equipment, just tools, a barrel of mixed hand tools for $10, here a box of sockets, and wrenches for $15 there, rebuilding the workshop inventory one auction at a time because the workshop that had burned had held 30 years of accumulated tools that could not be replaced new for any price he could afford. In the spring of 1972, Leland began looking for a barn. He was not looking to buy a new barn. He could not afford new construction, and he would not have done it that way even if he could because new construction required a contractor, and a contractor required cash he preferred to keep in the bank. He was looking for a barn that existed somewhere and needed to stop existing there, and could be made to exist on the Pruitt property for a price that was less than what its materials were worth assembled. He found it in Saline County, a pole building that had taken a direct hit from a tornado the previous spring. The frame was intact, but the roof and most of the cladding was gone, and the owner wanted the frame cleared from his property so he could reclaim the land. He sold it to Leland for $400 and told him he could take whatever he could haul. Leland and Harlan Goss spent 3 weekends taking it apart and loading it onto borrowed flatbed trailers and hauling it to the Pruitt property. They erected it on a new concrete pad that Leland poured himself, renting a mixer for $40 a day. He bought roofing tin from a grain elevator that was being demolished in York County. He bought sliding doors from a dairy operation that had closed in the next county over. Nothing matched. The tin was 3 different colors. The doors were hung from a track that had been designed for a different size opening and had been shemmed and adjusted until it worked. The barn was an improbable structure assembled from the remnants of other buildings by a man who cared more about whether it functioned than whether it was beautiful. It kept the rain off the Farmall. It gave Lee a shop floor and a workbench and walls with hooks for the tools he was accumulating, one auction lot at a time. It cost $2,800 total, including the frame purchase and the concrete in the tin and the doors and every other item that went into it. It was the second thing Leland had built since the fire, and it was his. The summer of 1973 nearly broke him. Not because of the crop. The crop was average, consistent, the kind of yield that a well-maintained farm in good ground produces in a normal year. The break came in July in the middle of the harvest on a Tuesday morning when Leland was 3 passes into the east field and the Farmall 560 lost its hydraulics. Not partially, completely. The hydraulic system went from working to not working between one pass and the next, the implements dropping to the ground as the pressure died, the tractor suddenly a machine that could pull but could not lift and could not operate anything that depended on hydraulic function. Leland sat on the tractor in the middle of the field for a moment. He did not swear. He did not hit anything. He sat and he looked at the crop that needed to be cut and at the combine that was waiting on the headland and at the sky that showed no sign of rain but would eventually show one. And he thought about what he needed and how he was going to get it. He needed a hydraulic control valve. He knew this from the symptoms and from his understanding of the system. The valve was the likely failure point given the way the system had died suddenly and completely rather than gradually. He needed to use one because new was not in the budget and because used would do the job if it was in reasonable condition. He drove the Farmall back to the barn on the road that ran along the edge of the field, the implements dragging uselessly behind it. He got into the truck. He drove to 3 equipment dealers and 2 salvage yards in an afternoon and found nothing. He drove to a scrap yard in the next county as evening was coming on, and a man there who had been in the salvage business for 30 years looked at what Leland needed and walked him to the back of a row of stripped equipment and pulled a valve from a machine that had been sitting in the weather long enough to make its provenance uncertain. $18. Leland drove home in the dark. He worked by the light in the barn through midnight and into the early morning, pulling the dead valve and installing the salvage one, bleeding the system, checking the fittings, testing the pressure with a gauge he had acquired at an auction and had repaired before it was useful. The work required patience, and it required precision, and it required the willingness to do it at 2 in the morning because the harvest that was sitting in the field could not wait for regular business hours. He finished at 3:30 in the morning. He tested the hydraulics. They worked. He went inside and slept for 2 hours. Then he went back to the field. The harvest was completed the following day. The delay cost him 1 day. 1 day was the difference between keeping everything on schedule and losing nothing except the day. But he had been in the barn at midnight with an $18 salvage valve and the question of what would happen if it did not work. And in the space of that question, he had understood something about the position he was in that he had not fully understood before. He was on a margin that had no cushion. If he lost the tractor, he lost the harvest. If he lost the harvest, he had 4 months of reserve and then nothing. He was not standing on solid ground. He was standing on ice, and the ice was thick enough, but it was ice and he needed to treat it accordingly. He did not change his plan. He continued with his plan. But he worked with a precision after that night that was slightly different from what he had brought to the work before. More specific, more attentive to the things that could fail and what he would do when they failed. He began keeping a small inventory of critical salvage parts in the barn, hydraulic fittings and electrical components, in the specific things that his experience told him were most likely to need attention, so that the next midnight crisis would not require a 2-county drive to a scrapyard before the solution could begin. The 3rd year brought the combine. He had been looking for 18 months, watching estate auctions and farm dispersal sales, and the notices that appeared in the agricultural paper about equipment changing hands. He was looking for something specific. A self-propelled combine with a 12-foot header in a condition that was bad enough that no one else wanted to pay what it was worth, but not so bad that the core mechanical systems could not be made sound with winter work and the right parts. He found it at an estate auction in the fall of 1973. A Massey Ferguson 35, the self-propelled model, sitting at the edge of the auction lot with a look of long disuse about it. The engine smoked under load. The reel bearings were shot and made a sound that kept casual bidders from raising their hands. The sieves needed replacing. The auction crowd looked at it and moved on to the items that required less imagination. Leland bid $2,200 and the room let him have it. He had the Massey Ferguson trailered to a salvage barn in October, and he spent the winter on it. Every evening after the day's work was done, and all of Saturday and Sunday afternoons after church, he worked on the combine in the barn, with the light overhead and the Nebraska winter outside. He replaced the real bearings. He sourced new sieves from a parts dealer 2 states away who had old stock at a price that fit his budget. He rebuilt the engine, diagnosing the smoke to a worn set of rings and replacing them and checking the valve seats while he had it apart. He went through the separator and the elevator and the hydraulic system and every component that could be inspected with the tools he had available. The total repair cost was $370 spread over 5 months of winter evenings. In July of 1974, Leland drove the Massey Ferguson into the East Field for the first harvest of his own wheat with his own combine since the fire. He positioned the machine on the headland and sat in the cab for a full minute before he engaged the header. He was thinking about the 3 years between this moment and the last time he had done this. The winter he had spent on the combine in the coal barn. The midnight hydraulic failure and the $18 valve. The harvest traded for tillage work because he did not have a machine of his own. The mobile home and the salvage barn and the tool lots bought by the box at farm auctions. The scorched Farmall that had started on the second try on a July morning when everything else on the farm was ash. He had told his daughter they were going to build it back. He had said it without a plan, without knowing how, on the basis of nothing except the decision that it was what would happen. 3 years later, he was sitting in a combine. He had rebuilt himself on the field he had farmed, without missing a season, about to harvest a crop that no one had given him and that no one had helped him grow. He engaged the header. The combine moved into the wheat. He cried in the cab, not dramatically, not loudly, the way a man cries when he is alone and something long held releases in him quietly and without audience, the tears of a man who has been carrying a weight long enough that when it begins to ease, he feels the easing as a physical thing. He let it happen, and then it was finished, and he kept harvesting. Nobody saw. Nobody needed to. The following year, Leland built grain storage. He had been watching the wheat prices for 2 years, and what he had watched had confirmed what he suspected, which was that the elevator price at harvest was always the worst price of the year, and that the farmers who could hold grain until February or March captured a premium that was not large, but was consistent and was the difference between the economics of subsistence and the economics of genuine progress. He built 2 small bins from salvaged corrugated steel panels, material from a demolished bin in York County, that he had purchased for almost nothing and hauled home on the flatbed. He bought a new auger from a dealer in Hastings, who was running an end-of-season sale, the only new piece of equipment he had purchased since the fire. He poured the concrete pads himself. The 2 bins together held 6,000 bushels, half of what he had lost in the fire, but enough to hold a significant portion of each harvest for the better price. The first year he used the bins, he stored 4,000 bushels of wheat and sold it in February instead of at harvest. The price difference was 37 cents a bushel. On 4,000 bushels, that was $1,480 that he would not have captured if he had sold at harvest the way he had always sold before. He sat at the kitchen table in the mobile home with the elevator receipts in front of him, and he looked at that number, and he was very still for a moment. $1,480 from the same crop, the same ground, the same work, simply by choosing when to sell, instead of accepting the harvest day price as the only option available. The 2 bins had cost him $3,100 to build. They would pay for themselves in 2 years, and then the premium they captured would be money that had not existed before he built them. He had not borrowed anything to build them. He had not asked anyone's advice about whether to build them. He had watched the prices for 2 years, and he had done the arithmetic, and he had built what the arithmetic told him to build. That was the only consultation he required. Vera had seen him working through the numbers the previous spring when he was first considering the bins. She had looked at his calculations on the kitchen table one evening and not said anything for a moment. Then she had said that the numbers looked right to her and that she thought he should do it. That was the extent of the consultation. It was enough. By the end of 1975, 4.5 years after the fire, Leland had a salvage barn that kept the rain out, and a combine he had rebuilt from an estate auction machine, and 2 grain bins, and the Farmall 560 with its scorched paint and its mismatched seat, and over 6,000 hours of post-fire work on the meter. He had $29,000 in the bank, counting the untouched insurance payout. He had spent less than $5,000 total on the mobile home and the barn and the tools and the operating costs of 4 farming seasons. He had not borrowed a dollar. Merle Kimball was still running the John Deere dealership in Geneva. His showroom had a new model year on the floor, and he was financing sales the way he had always financed sales, with the easy confidence of a man who expects the future to continue resembling the present. He drove past the Pruitt property twice a week on his way to and from the dealership, and he had stopped making jokes about burned tractors and mobile homes sometime in 1973, though he had not said why and no one had asked. The fall of 1975, Leland began building the house, not the mobile home. The mobile home had served its purpose and would stay on the property as additional space. But it was not what Leland had in mind when he had made the promise on the steps in the dark to his 7-year-old daughter. What he had in mind was a house, a real one. 3 bedrooms and a kitchen and a living room and a bathroom and floors that would not flex when you walked on them, and walls that would not transmit the sound of the wind the way mobile home walls do. He had been holding the insurance money for 4 years, waiting for this. He had farmed with farming income, and he had held the insurance money for structures because structures were what it was for, and the house was a structure. And now, in the fall of 1975, he had what he needed to build it. He designed it himself. Not architecturally. He was not an architect, and he did not have the money for one. He drew it on graph paper at the kitchen table, working out the room sizes and the roof pitch and the window placement with the same methodical attention he gave to anything that required planning. Small, efficient, enough room for the 3 of them, and not more than enough. He had no interest in a house that was larger than what they needed. Harlan Goss came, and the 2 men who farmed on the other side of the county road came on a Saturday in October, and they framed the house in a week. Not fancy framing. Honest framing, the kind that goes up fast when the men doing it know what they are doing and have the materials organized before they start. Leland had organized everything. Lumber delivered the previous week and stacked by size. Hardware sorted and labeled. No time lost looking for what was needed because everything was where it needed to be. They roofed it in 2 days the following weekend. Leland spent the rest of the fall doing the interior himself. Evenings and Saturdays, the electrical and the plumbing and the drywall and the painting. Vera did the kitchen-making decisions about the cabinets and the fixtures with the practical precision she brought to everything, choosing what worked over what was impressive. Delia was 12 years old. She had been 12 for 2 months when the interior painting was done, and Leland told her she could choose the color for her own bedroom. She stood in the paint aisle at the hardware store for a long time, considering the options, with the seriousness of a 12-year-old who understands that this decision is not temporary, but permanent, that she is choosing something that will be part of this house for a long time. She chose yellow, a specific yellow, not pale and not aggressive, the yellow of sunlight on a wall in late afternoon, and Leland bought the paint, and Delia painted her bedroom herself with a roller while he watched from the doorway. She was thorough about it. She cut in the edges carefully with a brush before she used the roller the way Leland had shown her, and she did 2 coats and let them dry completely between coats, and when she was done, the room was yellow in a way that suited it, that made it feel like a room that belonged to a person who had chosen it rather than a room that had been assigned to her. The house cost $11,400 in the materials. Leland paid it from the insurance fund, the money he had been holding for 4 years, for exactly this purpose. He had planned it from the beginning. Use the farming income for the farm. Hold the insurance money for the house. Patient, methodical, the way his father had taught him to approach things that mattered. On Christmas morning of 1975, the Pruitt family woke up in their own house for the first time in 4.5 years. Not the mobile home, the house. The one Leland had built with Harlan Goss and 2 neighbors in a week of framing and finished himself through a fall of evening work. With pine floors and vinyl siding and a kitchen where Vera had arranged the cabinets the way she wanted them, and a bedroom with yellow walls where a 12-year-old girl slept with her stuffed rabbit on a shelf above the bed now instead of in her arms. Delia ran down the hallway on Christmas morning in her socks on the wood floor, the particular sliding run of a child who has discovered that socks on wood floors allow a kind of locomotion that is not quite running and not quite sliding and is entirely satisfying. And she came into the kitchen where Leland was sitting with his coffee at the table he had built himself from oak he had found at the salvage yard. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at her father at the table. She looked at the window above the sink that showed the farm outside in the Christmas morning light, the salvage barn and the grain bins, and The Farmall 560 parked in the yard with its scorched paint and its mismatched seat, the machine that had started on the second try while everything else was ash. "Daddy," she said, "we didn't lose the farm." Leland looked at his daughter. 12 years old, taller than he expected her to be every time he looked at her, the specific surprise of watching a child grow when you are not paying attention to the growing. He thought about the night she had asked him the first version of that question, standing barefoot in the dark on the neighbor's steps, while the ruins of the farm were still warm. He thought about the 4.5 years between that night and this morning. He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "we didn't." He said it the same way he had said the original promise. Not as a boast and not as a speech. As a fact. As a statement about what had happened and how it had ended up. Outside the window, the farm was there. All of it. Not the same as what had burned. Different in the ways that things built by a single man from salvage and patience are different from things built by contractors with borrowed money. But there, standing, working, belonging to no one except the people who had built it. The land had not burned. Leland had always known it had not burned. From the morning after the fire, when he had sat on the Farmall 560 listening to the engine idle in the ruins, he had known that the land was still there, and that the land was the thing that mattered. Everything that had been built on it before could be built again if the man doing the building was willing to do it one season at a time and not ask for more than the work could produce in each season. He had done it one season at a time. He had not asked for more than the work could produce. And on Christmas morning of 1975, his daughter slid across the kitchen floor in her socks, and he drank his coffee, and outside the window the farm stood in the winter light, imperfect and salvaged and entirely his. In the fall of 1976, Merle Kimball drove past the Pruitt property on a Tuesday afternoon and did something he had not done in 5 years of driving that road. He stopped. He pulled his truck onto the shoulder of the county road, and he sat behind the wheel and he looked at what was there. The salvage barn with its mismatched tin and its differently colored doors standing solid against the October sky. The 2 grain bins catching the afternoon light. The small white house with the yellow bedroom window on the east side, a detail he could see clearly because the cottonwoods had not yet lost their leaves and the window caught the light at that angle in the afternoon. The Massey Ferguson combine in the equipment yard beside the salvage farm, all 560 with its scorched paint that 5 years of Nebraska weather had not erased and would not erase. A working farm. Not the farm that had been there before July 14th of 1971. Something different. Something built from different materials by different means and therefore carrying in its surfaces a different kind of evidence than the farm that had burned. The farm that had burned had been built slowly over decades from the proceeds of good work and careful management. This farm had been built in 5 years from salvage and harvest proceeds and the specific stubbornness of a man who had made a promise to his daughter and who did not have it in him to break it. Merle sat looking at it for a long time. Then he drove to the co-op and found Harlan Goss buying seat at the back counter, and he stood beside him and said something that did not come naturally to him. "When did Leland Pruitt rebuild his farm?" Merle said. Harlan looked at him. He had known Merle Kimball for 20 years. He knew the question was harder to ask than it appeared. 5 years, Merle Harlan said. "You have been driving past it every week. Leland does not make noise. He just works." Merle was quiet for a moment. "How much did it cost him?" Merle said. "You would have to ask him," Harlan said. "But I know he did not borrow a dollar, paid cash for everything, built most of it himself." Merle did not say anything else. He bought what he had come for, and he drove home. He never publicly said that he had been wrong about Leland Pruitt and the burned Farmall and the mobile home and whether what Leland was doing was farming or camping. He was not a man who made that kind of public accounting. But he stopped making any version of the joke, and the men who had heard him make it noticed the absence of it, the way you notice when a sound that has been present for a long time stops, not immediately, but eventually as a quiet that has a specific shape. Leland heard about Merle stopping on the road the same way he had heard about the camping joke 5 years earlier, through the particular circulation of information that small farming communities maintain about their own members. A man at the elevator mentioned it to him in passing. Leland listened and nodded and thanked him for telling him. He did not feel triumphant about it. He did not feel vindicated in any particular way that required expression. What he felt was something quieter and less dramatic than vindication. He felt the simple satisfaction of a man who has done the work he said he would do, and who has been doing it for long enough that the doing has become its own answer to every question that was ever asked about whether it was possible. He went back to work. The late 1970s were good years on the Pruitt farm. Not spectacular, not the kind of years that produce stories about unexpected wealth. Good years, consistent years, the kind that a man who farms his ground carefully and maintains his equipment and watches the market and makes his decisions based on observation rather than optimism produces one after another. The grain bins paid for themselves in 2 years, as the arithmetic had predicted. The custom work with the Farmall brought in cash through the slow seasons. The farm had found its rhythm. Vera was at the kitchen table every evening with the ledger. She tracked everything. She had a gift for seeing where the numbers were going before they arrived there, for reading the direction of a financial situation from its early indicators, the way a farmer reads the weather. She did not make decisions. Leland made decisions, but she gave him information that was accurate and current, and she told him what she saw in the numbers with the directness of a woman who had watched her family live in a mobile home for 4.5 years, because the decisions had been right ones, and she intended to make sure the next decisions were right ones too. Delia was growing. She was in high school by the mid-70s, a serious and attentive student who brought the same quality of observation to her schoolwork that she had always brought to watching her father work on machinery and asking questions about what each part did. She was going to go to college. Leland and Vera had agreed on this not because they expected her to leave the farm permanently, but because they believed that a person who understood more than one way of thinking about a problem was better equipped than a person who only understood one. She went to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln in the fall of 1982. She studied agricultural economics, which was the field that mapped most directly onto the questions she had been asking since she was old enough to ride in the cab of the Massey Ferguson and wonder why wheat prices moved the way they moved and what the forces were that determined when a farmer made money and when he did not. She was good at it. Her professors noted that she had the kind of practical intuition about agricultural markets that usually only comes from growing up on a working farm, the ability to translate abstract economic concepts into the specific decisions that real farmers faced in real seasons. The early 1980s were when the farm crisis arrived, not for Leland, for everyone else. The crisis had been building for years in the way that crises build gradually and then suddenly visible in retrospect at every stage and invisible in prospect, because the people who might have seen it were the same people who were benefiting from the conditions that made it inevitable. Interest rates that had been low became high. Commodity prices that had been rising fell. Land that had been used as collateral for loans lost the value that had made it useful as collateral. Farmers who had borrowed against the expectation that the good years would continue found themselves owing money that their crops could not service at the prices the crops were bringing. It was the worst farm crisis since the Great Depression. Farms that had been in families for 3 and 4 generations were lost in foreclosure proceedings that moved with a speed that felt indecent, the accumulated work of a lifetime converted into a bank's balance sheet entry in the time it took a judge to sign a paper. The equipment dealers who had encouraged the borrowing were themselves caught in the same current, their floor plan financing tied to the same interest rates that were drowning their customers. Merle Kimball's dealership struggled through 1982 and 1983 and into 1984. His showroom held inventory that no one could afford to buy. His receivables included loans that were not being serviced. His bank had conversations with him that resembled the conversations Roy Stassen had had with Leland Pruitt in the yard on a July morning 12 years earlier. The conversations about settlements and fresh starts and somewhere else. Merle did not close. He survived the crisis the way a man survives something he has been warned about and did not fully believe until it was on him. He reduced, he adapted. He came out the other side with a smaller operation and a different understanding of how quickly conditions could change, and he never again told anyone that they needed new equipment when their old equipment was running. Leland did not experience the farm crisis as a crisis. He experienced it as a confirmation of the principle his father had given him. Never owe more than you can pay if the worst year of your life happens tomorrow. He owed nothing. The farm was free and clear. When the commodity prices fell, his income fell, but his obligations did not rise to meet the falling income because he had no obligations that required a particular price to service. In 1984, the farm to the south of the Pruitt property went into foreclosure. It was 60 acres, a partial parcel that had been the northern section of a larger operation that could not survive the crisis. The bank was asking less for it than it was worth because the bank wanted it off its books, and land was hard to move in 1984, and anything was better than carrying it. Leland bought it for cash, not the insurance money. That had been spent on the house 9 years earlier. This was farming income accumulated over 13 years of harvests and custom work, and the premium captured by the grain bins in the good years, in the discipline of spending less than the farm produced in all the years, including the bad ones. 60 acres at a price that reflected the desperation of the seller rather than the value of the ground. Leland walked the addition the day the paperwork was done and stood at the boundary between his original 200 acres and the new 60 and looked at what was now 260 acres of Fillmore County ground that owed nothing to anyone. He was 51 years old. He thought about his father's handshake in 1960. He thought about the lightning at 2:14 in the morning in July of 1971. He thought about the Farmall 560 starting on the second try in the dawn while the ruins were still warm. He thought about Roy Stassen's $77,000 and the form that had never been signed. He thought about all of the years between that morning and this one, and he stood at the boundary of his expanded farm, and he thought that the years had been worth exactly what they had cost, which was everything, and had produced exactly what they had produced, which was this ground, this ownership, this specific freedom that comes to a man who has never owed what he could not pay. He walked back to the house and told Vera what he had been thinking. She looked at him from the kitchen table where she was working on the ledger. "Your father would have approved," she said. He thought that was right. The Farmall 560 continued to work through the 1980s. By the mid-decade, it had accumulated over 15,000 hours on the meter, a number that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had seen it sitting in the yard in August of 1971, with its scorched paint and its melted seat cushion and its warped steering wheel. It had been rebuilt once the engine in 1983, when the rings had worn past the point where the oil consumption could be managed with maintenance rather than repair. Leland spent a winter on the rebuild the way he had spent the winter of 1973 and 1974 on the Massey Ferguson evenings in the salvage barn with the light overhead and the tools arranged in the order he would need them. The hydraulics had never been touched. Not since the midnight crisis in July of 1973 when the $18 salvage valve had gotten him through the harvest. After that repair, he had gone through the system carefully and replaced every fitting and line that showed wear, and the system had run without complaint for a decade and more. By 1992, the Farmall had 22,000 hours on it. Leland was 59 years old and the machine was 28 years old, and both of them had given what they had to give to the work, and both of them had given it without complaint and without failure at any moment when failure would have been catastrophic. He brought the Farmall in from the field on a November afternoon and drove it into the salvage barn for the last time as a working machine. He sat on the seat for a while after he shut the engine off. The barn was quiet, the way barns are quiet when the work is done, the particular settled silence of a building that has been full of effort and is now at rest. The tools on their hooks along the wall, the workbench with its surface worn smooth from 20 years of use, the light coming in through the west window at the angle of late afternoon. Leland put his hand on the hood. The paint was what it was. The scorched discoloration that he had covered with black spray paint in 1971 had never fully gone, had persisted through every subsequent painting as a presence beneath whatever color was on top, a ghost of the fire that had made the machine what it had become. He had stopped trying to cover it years ago. It was part of what the tractor was. You could not separate the machine from its history any more than you could separate a man from his. He found a piece of scrap wood in the corner of the barn. A section of oak board left over from some earlier project, dry and sound, and about the right size for what he had in mind. He got the soldering iron from the workbench, and he sat at the bench, and he burned the words into the wood carefully, each letter formed with the deliberate attention of a man who wants the thing he is making to last. This tractor survived the fire of July 14, 1971. So did we. He mounted it on the wall behind the tractor and stepped back and looked at it. It said what he wanted it to say, not more than that. He was not a man who needed to say more than what was true. Delia came home for Christmas that year from Lincoln, where she had been working for the agricultural cooperative for 8 years. She was 28 years old. She stood in the barn doorway and read the sign and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, that is exactly right." He thought so too. The years continued. Leland farmed his 260 acres through the 90s with the patience and the discipline that had always characterized the operation, adapting to the changes in the market and the changes in the technology without losing the fundamental approach that had sustained the farm through every difficulty since the fire. He was not an early adopter. He was not the first man in Fillmore County to do anything new. He was the man who watched what the new things produced and adopted them when the evidence was clear and the price was right and the need was real. Vera remained at the kitchen table with the ledger. Though the ledger had become a computer in the early 90s, a change she made without sentiment because the computer was more accurate and faster, and she was not a woman who confused the tool with the work. The work was keeping the numbers straight and understanding what they meant. The computer did not change that, it only did it faster. They grew older together on the farm the way farm couples grow older, with the particular quality of two people who have been through the worst thing together and have found that the having been through it has made something between them that is stronger than what existed before, not easier, not without friction, stronger. The kind of bond that is not a comfort so much as a certainty, the knowledge that the person beside you has already been tested by the worst and has not broken. In the late 1990s, Leland noticed something in Delia that he recognized because he had seen it in himself. She came home more often than she had before. She walked the fields on those visits with the attentiveness of someone who is not simply visiting, but assessing, looking at the ground with the eyes of someone who is asking a question about it that she has not yet said aloud. He said nothing about it. He waited. He had learned from farming and from being a father that some things arrive in their own time and cannot be hurried without being damaged. In the spring of 2001, Delia called from Lincoln. She said she had been thinking about the farm. She said she had been thinking about coming home. She said it the way she said most things, directly and without preamble, the way Leland said most things, because she had grown up watching him say things directly and without preamble, and it had become the way she was. Leland listened. He told her that the farm was there. He told her it was hers whenever she was ready for it. He told her that he was 68 years old and that he had been farming for 40 years and that he had done what he had set out to do and that the next chapter of what this land would become was hers to write. She came home that summer. She was 37 years old. She drove down the county road on an August morning and turned onto the gravel drive and parked in front of the salvage barn that her father had built from a tornado-damaged frame in Saline County in the winter of 1972, and that was still standing, still functional, still keeping the rain off what needed to be kept dry. She walked through the barn door. She found the Farmall 560 in the corner where it had stood for 9 years. She put her hand on the hood. She read the sign. She stood in the barn for a long time with the smell of oil and dry dust and old machinery around her, and she thought about the things she had seen from that farm. She had seen her father drive a scorched tractor to the field 3 weeks after a fire that should have ended everything. She had seen the mobile home that her parents had made a home without complaint or embarrassment, had done her homework at a folding table in that mobile home, and had gone to school and come back and done it again, and not once felt that the mobile home was what defined them, because what defined them was not where they lived, but how they lived and what they would not give up, regardless of what the circumstances said they should give up. She had seen the salvage barn go up piece by piece over 3 weekends of work. She had seen her father in the barn at midnight with an $18 valve because the harvest could not wait for regular hours. She had seen him cry in the cab of the Massey Ferguson in July of 1974 when he harvested his first crop with his own combine, and she had known about it because he had come in from the field that afternoon with a specific quality of settled calm about him that she had been old enough to recognize as something having been resolved. She had seen the house go up in a week of framing and be finished over a fall of evenings. She had chosen yellow paint for her bedroom and painted it herself with 2 coats and a careful brush at the edges, and she had slept in that room for 6 years before she went to college, and she had come back to it every Christmas and every summer for 20 years after that. She had seen all of this, And now she was standing in the barn at 37 years old, and it was her turn to decide what came next. Leland was in the house when she came in from the barn. He was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the farm the way he had looked out the window on Christmas morning in 1975, when his 12-year-old daughter had slid across the floor in her socks and told him they had not lost the farm. The same table, the same window, the same farm outside older now, with the accumulated evidence of another 25 years of care in its surfaces. Delia sat down across from him. They talked for most of the morning, not about sentiment, about farming, about what the operation looked like and where it was strong and where it had room to improve and what the next 5 years might reasonably produce given the market conditions and the state of the equipment and the characteristics of the ground. Delia brought what she had learned from 10 years of agricultural economics work in Lincoln. Leland brought 40 years of farming that particular ground. The conversation between those two bodies of knowledge was productive in the way that conversations between experience and analysis are productive when both sides are willing to listen to the other. By midday, they had talked through most of what needed talking through. Leland drove to Geneva in the afternoon and did what he had been planning to do for several months. He had a conversation at a lawyer's office about the farm's legal structure and what it would take to transfer management responsibility to Delia while maintaining the ownership arrangement that would eventually pass the farm to her fully. The lawyer had done this kind of thing before and knew what questions to ask, and the conversation was efficient. He drove home in the evening and told Vera what they had discussed. She listened with the same attention she brought to the ledger. She said it sounded right. He thought it sounded right too. The following January, Leland Pruitt stepped back from the day-to-day management of the Pruitt farm in Fillmore County, Nebraska, and his daughter Delia stepped into it. Not a ceremony, not a formal event. A morning when Leland did not go to the equipment barn at first light, and Delia did, and from that morning forward the pattern continued with Delia in the barn, and Leland at the kitchen table with his coffee and the window that showed him the farm he had built from ash and salvage, and the refusal to accept someone else's definition of what was possible. He was not idle. Men like Leland Pruitt do not become idle. He was at the barn every day, available when Delia wanted a second perspective on something present for the decisions that benefited from his 40 years of knowledge of this specific ground and its specific characteristics. But he had stepped back and she had stepped forward, and the farm had not missed a beat in the transition. Because she had been watching it her whole life, and because he had told her everything he knew. Vera died in 2005. She had been ill for 2 years, the same gradual kind of illness that takes a person by degrees rather than all at once. And she had managed it with the same practicality she had brought to everything else, keeping the ledger current through most of it, and training Delia in the specific systems she had developed over 40 years of tracking the farm's finances so that the knowledge did not leave with her. Leland was alone in the house for the years after that. Not isolated. Delia was there every day, and the neighbors who had been neighbors for decades were still neighbors. And Harlan Goss, now well into his 80s, still stopped by on Tuesdays the way he had always stopped by on Tuesdays. But the house had the quality that houses have when the person who made them most fully inhabited is gone, a fullness that is no longer there felt as an absence in the rooms. He worked through it the way he had worked through everything, by being present for what was in front of him rather than absorbed by what was not. Leland Pruitt died in September of 2009. He was 76 years old. He had gone to the barn in the morning, and the way he went every morning had come back to the house and had his coffee and had sat in the chair by the window and had simply not gotten up again. The doctor said his heart had stopped, said it had been building for some time, said it was peaceful, which was a word that doctors use in those circumstances, and that in this case happened to be accurate. Delia found him in the chair by the window looking out at the farm. The funeral was held at the church in Geneva on a Saturday. More than 200 people came. Not because Leland Pruitt had been a famous man, or a powerful man, or a man who had done things that appeared in newspapers. They came because he had been in Fillmore County for 50 years, and in that time he had been the kind of man who showed up when people needed help, and did not show up uninvited, and kept his word on every agreement he made, and never asked anyone to believe he was something other than what he was. Harlan Goss, 84 years old, sat in the front row and wept without embarrassment. The weeping of a man who has lived long enough that most of the people he has worked beside are gone, and who feels each absence as the specific loss of a specific person and not as the general condition of old age. Merle Kimball came. He sat in the back row and did not speak to anyone in particular. He sat and he listened and he drove home. He had sold his dealership in the mid-90s to a younger man from Hastings, and he had retired with enough to live on, and he had spent the years since driving past the Pruitt property twice a week, the same as always, watching the farm continue to do what it had always done, which was to be a farm. Roy Stassen did not come. Roy Stassen had retired from Great Plains Mutual in 1989 and had moved to Arizona for his health, and Delia did not know if he was still alive, and she did not spend time wondering about it. He had done his job the way he understood his job, and he had been wrong about what the unsigned form would eventually become, and that was the whole of what she had to say about Roy Stassen. Delia spoke at the service. She did not talk about farming technique or financial discipline or salvage construction or any of the specific practical achievements that had characterized her father's life. She talked about a question and a promise. She talked about being 7 years old and standing barefoot in the ashes of the only home she had ever known, and asking her father whether they were going to lose the farm. She talked about the answer he gave her when he had nothing in his hands except $400 and a burned tractor, in the absolute absence of any reasonable guarantee that the answer he was about to give was the truth. She talked about what it means when a man makes a promise from a position like that. Not from comfort, not from certainty, from the decision that the promise is what he is choosing to be true, regardless of what the circumstances say about whether it is possible. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and she took out a piece of paper. Yellowed, folded many times along the same creases. She unfolded it carefully. "This is the receipt for the mobile home my father bought in August of 1971, she said. 3 months after the fire, $2,200. That was our first home after the fire. I grew up in that mobile home. I did my homework at a folding table in that mobile home. I was 12 years old when we moved into the house my father built." She paused. "I never once felt poor living in that mobile home. Not once, because my father never acted like we were. He never treated it as a defeat. It was where we lived while he was building what we needed. That is all it was." She folded the receipt and put it back in her pocket. "My father had $400 and a burned tractor," she said. "He had 200 acres of ground that had not burned. He had a crop in the field that the fire had not touched. And he had the understanding that the land was still there, and that if the land was there, you could start again. That was what he had. And from those things, he built the farm that is standing right now in Fillmore County while we are in this building. He built it without borrowing, without asking anyone for anything except the kind of neighbor help that he gave back in equal measure every time it was needed." She looked at the people in the church. The insurance man told him to take the settlement and start over somewhere else. My father did not sign. The equipment dealer said he was camping, not farming. My father built a house. The neighbors waited to see if he would fail. He did not fail. He just worked. She was quiet for a moment. "There is a sign in the barn on our farm. My father burned the words into a piece of scrap wood with a soldering iron the day he put the Farmall 560 in for the last time. I have read it more times than I can count. It says this tractor survived the fire of July 14th, 1971. So did we." She looked out at the people in the pews. "That is the story," she said. "That is all of it. A fire and a man who decided that the fire was not the end of the story, and 38 years of working to make that decision true. The tractor survived because he had not finished a grease job the night before the fire. The farm survived because he refused to sign a piece of paper. My father and I are both here because one night when I was 7 years old and everything was burning, he looked at me and told me the truth before he knew it was true." She stepped back from the podium and sat down. The church was silent for a long moment. 200 people and not a sound except the settling of the old building in the September morning. Delia farms the 260 acres today. The Farmall 560 stands in the corner of the salvage barn, in the same spot where Leland parked it in November of 1992, with 22,000 hours on it. The barn itself is still standing, the mismatched tin and the differently colored doors in the concrete pad that Leland poured himself in the winter of 1972, holding together the way things hold together when they are built to work rather than to impress. The sign is still on the wall behind the tractor. The wood has darkened with the years, but the letters are still clear, burned deep enough that no amount of time will obscure them. This tractor survived the fire of July 14th, 1971. So did we. Delia's children know the story. Her son is 15 and her daughter is 12, and they have grown up with it the way children grow up with the stories that are told in their families, not as formal instruction, but as the accumulated context of a life. They know about the fire and the $400 and the grease job that was not finished and the question their mother asked when she was 7 years old standing barefoot in the ashes. They know because Delia has told them, not as a lesson with a moral attached, as a story about what happened. The moral is in the story itself, in the specific sequence of decisions and refusals and mornings in the barn and evenings at the kitchen table and seasons that were planted and tended and harvested one after another for 38 years, because a man decided on a night in July of 1971 that the fire was not the end of the story. Every year on July 14th, Delia walks to the barn in the morning. She walks to the corner where the Farmall 560 stands. She puts her hand on the hood, the way her father put his hand on it, the way her father's hand taught her hand to do it, with the specific quality of attention that is not sentiment but recognition, the recognition of what the machine is and what it represents and what it took to bring it from the morning of July 15th, 1971, when it was the only working thing on a burned farm, to the present morning, when it stands in a barn, on a farm that is whole and paid for and tended by the daughter of the man who refused to let it end. She reads the sign, then she goes to work. The land did not burn. Leland Pruitt had known this from the morning he sat on the Farmall 560 in the ruins and heard the engine catch on the second turn. The fire had taken everything that sat above the ground. It had not reached what was in the ground and what the ground could produce if the man responsible for it was willing to work it one season at a time and not ask the work to produce more in any single season than the work could honestly produce. $400, a burned tractor, 200 acres of Nebraska ground, a promise made to a 7-year-old girl in the dark on a neighbor's steps while the ruins were still warm. That was what he had. That was enough. The land is still there. The farm is still there. The tractor that survived the fire is still in the barn with the sign her father made, and the scorched paint that no repainting has ever fully covered, and the 22,000 hours of post-fire work recorded on its meter, like a document of what it means to refuse a settlement and build it back instead. Delia Pruitt puts her hand on the hood every July 14th, and she says what her father said to her in the dark when she was 7 years old. And he had nothing, and the fire was still burning behind him, and the promise he was about to make was the only thing he had to offer. We did not lose the farm. He kept that promise. The land never burned.